Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown faces unthinkable danger, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K., Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The Stranger Who Knew Too Much. The rain came down in a steady rhythm, drumming against the pavement like the ticking of some cosmic clock, indifferent to the sins of the city. Father Brown pulled his coat tighter against the chill and stepped onto the glistening sidewalk. The gaslights flickered in the mist, and neon signs buzzed weakly above empty streets. Somewhere, a saxophone wept in the distance. This was a city that had long since stopped believing in saints. But even among its shadows, there were men whose secrets needed unraveling. It was late when he arrived at the Blue Orchid, a bar with peeling wallpaper and air thick with cigarette smoke. A place where broken men nursed their failures in heavy glasses and hopeful women searched for a way out before it was too late. The kind of place where, if someone went missing, no one asked too many questions. He wasn't there for a drink, though he wouldn't have been refused one, but because a letter had found its way to St. Dominic's earlier that evening. A simple note, the ink smudged as if the writer's hand had trembled. Father Brown, I know something I shouldn't. Meet me at the Blue Orchid, midnight, no name, no reason, just fear, wrapped in ink. Father Brown was used to fear. He had seen it in the confessional, heard it in the voices of men who wanted to be saved but weren't sure they deserved it. He knew the scent of guilt just as surely as he knew the bitterness of sin. So he had come, moving quietly through a world that often mistook silence for weakness. The bartender, a man with a face like an old boxing glove, looked him over but didn't say a word. A priest, in a place like this, it wasn't his business. The whiskey poured itself, and the sinners drank without shame. Father Brown moved to a table in the corner, his eyes scanning the room. The note had been desperate, urgent, but there was no sign of the man who had sent it. Instead, there was her. She sat at the bar, wrapped in a dress as dark as midnight and just as dangerous. A cigarette smoldered between her fingers, the red tip burning softly, the way a fuse does before an explosion. Her eyes flicked toward him, casual but not careless. She was watching him, which meant, of course, that she was the one he needed to watch. Father Brown had met women like her before, though the church pews saw few. She was the kind of woman who knew the cost of a secret and how to make a man pay it. Not with seduction, though that was a currency often spent, but with something sharper. Manipulation, perhaps. Deception. Maybe even the truth, though only when it suited her. She stubbed out her cigarette and slid off the stool, crossing the room in a slow, deliberate way that suggested she never hurried for anyone. Father Brown, she said, her voice like velvet wrapped around a knife. I should have known you'd come. He inclined his head slightly, his small round face unreadable. It's usually polite to introduce oneself before assuming familiarity. A smirk. In my line of work, names are expensive. Let's just say I go by Lily. Father Brown watched her. And what line of work is that? She smiled then, but it wasn't warm. The kind that knows when to keep its mouth shut. That sounds exhausting, he said simply. She slid into the chair across from him, tapping her nails against the tabletop. The man who wrote you that letter, he's dead, or worse. He came to me before he came to you. Said he had something big, something that could tear this whole city apart, and then he disappeared. Father Brown's hands remained folded on the table, his face unreadable. Disappeared is an interesting word. It often means something far less clean. She gave a dry little laugh. You don't spook easy, do you, Father? No, he said. I've spent too much time looking at the truth to be afraid of it. Her eyes flicked toward the door. You should be careful, though. There are people who don't like men who ask too many questions, especially not men who are supposed to be more concerned with saving souls than solving crimes. Father Brown sighed. The trouble with saving souls, my dear, is that crime often gets in the way. A shadow fell across the table. A man, broad-shouldered and built like a battering ram, had appeared. At their side, his knuckles were scarred, and his suit fit, like he'd borrowed it from a bigger corpse. The boss wants to see you, priest, the man said. Father Brown adjusted his glasses. The boss? You ask a lot of questions for a holy man. Only when the answers matter. The brute's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then you'd better come along. The answers are waiting. Lily exhaled smoke, watching the exchange. Careful, Father. The last man who wanted answers ended up face down in the river. Father Brown stood, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. A priest in water isn't as strange as you'd think. Baptisms are quite common. The thug didn't appreciate the joke. He just jerked his head toward the door. Father Brown followed, stepping out into the rain. The car waiting for them was sleek, black, and had the smell of leather and bad intentions. The man inside wore a suit that probably cost more than the church's monthly tithe. A scar ran from the corner of his eye down to his jaw like a crack in a porcelain mask. Father Brown, he said, voice smooth as oil on water, I hear you've been asking about a man who knew too much. I tend to be concerned when men disappear, Father Brown said mildly. The man smiled, but there was no humor in it. That's a dangerous habit. Some men don't want to be found. Father Brown met his gaze, steady and unafraid. And some men don't have a choice. The car hummed. In the silence, the city moving past in streaks of light and shadow. The man with the scar leaned in slightly. Tell me, Father, do you believe in redemption? Father Brown tilted his head. I believe in forgiveness, but that requires confession. The man chuckled. That's the trouble, isn't it? Not everyone wants to confess. Then they will have to live with their sins. Father Brown said, quietly. A pause. Then the man sighed, tapping his fingers against the seat. Our mutual acquaintance, the one who wrote you, had something he shouldn't have. He thought he could use it, make things difficult. That was a mistake. Mistakes can be corrected, Father Brown said. The man studied him. Are you offering me absolution, Father? Father Brown's gaze didn't waver. I'm offering you a choice. For a long moment, no one spoke. The rain whispered against the windows, the city's sins running through the gutters. Then the man nodded once. The car slowed. The door unlocked. Walk away, Father, he said. This isn't your fight. Father Brown stepped out onto the sidewalk. The car rolled away, vanishing into the night. Lily was waiting under a street lamp, watching him. Well, he sighed. The man who knew too much isn't coming back. She nodded, lighting another cigarette. And the people responsible? Father Brown looked at her, rain glistening on his round glasses. A man can run from the law. He cannot run from himself. She smirked. That sounds an awful lot like faith, Father. It is, he said. And in the end, that's what will catch him. The city pulsed around them. Neon lights and broken dreams. Somewhere, a sinner was still running. But Father Brown knew the truth. Sooner or later, all men must face judgment. And some judgments don't need a courtroom. Chapter 2. A Prayer for the Damned. The city never really slept. It just lay there, restless and twitching, turning its sins over in the dark. The rain had come and gone, leaving the streets slick like an open wound, reflecting the dim glow of neon signs that buzzed like dying flies. Father Brown walked with quiet steps, his coat buttoned against the damp night, his hat low enough to keep the world from seeing too much of his face. He had been summoned, though not by bells or prayers. The letter had been left at St. Dominic's just before Vespers. No signature, only a few trembling words scrawled on thin paper. Father Brown, I have nowhere left to turn. Meet me at St. Augustine's at midnight. God forgive me. There were places in the city where men still clung to their faith, and there were places where faith was just another lost thing, like the ghosts of old money or the laughter of children who had long since learned to keep quiet. St. Augustine's was somewhere in between, too old to be forgotten, too empty to be truly remembered. The church loomed in the mist, its steeple stabbing upward like a broken promise. The doors hung open slightly, breathing out the cold scent of old stone and candle wax. Father Brown stepped inside, and the hush of the place swallowed him. The light flickered uncertainly, the great vaulted ceiling stretching into shadows. A man sat in the front pew, head bowed, fingers laced as if in prayer. But there was nothing peaceful about his posture. He was folded inward, the way a man collapses when the weight of something unseen has finally broken him. Father Brown moved forward, quiet as a whisper. You sent for me, he said softly. The man flinched. Then he turned, and in the dim glow of the sanctuary light, his face was pale, drawn. His eyes were sharp, but not in the way of a man accustomed to thinking. They were sharp the way an animal's are when it knows it's cornered. Father, he breathed, and there was something desperate in the way he said it. I don't know why I thought you could help. Because you know what I am, Father Brown said simply, and because confession is easier when the night is closing in. The man let out something like a laugh, but it was broken in the middle. I never was much of a believer, he muttered. But now I don't know what else to do. Father Brown studied him. Tell me. The man swallowed hard. His hands clenched, unclenched. A week ago, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. A man. Or maybe just a shadow with a name. He did something terrible. And now, I think he means to do the same to me. Father Brown nodded slightly. And you haven't gone to the police, because this shadow has friends in the force. A humorless smirk twisted the man's lips. Smart priest. It doesn't take much intelligence to see how the world bends when men twist it to their will, Father Brown said. It only takes patience. The man exhaled slowly, like he was trying to let go of something that had wrapped itself around his ribs. His name is Lucio Cardona, a gangster, a killer, but one with clean hands. People disappear, but no one can ever prove he was holding the knife. Father Brown didn't blink. And what did you see? The man hesitated. I saw him in the back of the Blue Orchid. He had someone with him. A man I knew. Danny Russo. A small-time thief, but nothing serious. I don't know what Danny did, but Lucio, he made it clear he wasn't leaving that room alive. Father Brown's voice remained gentle. And did he? The man shook his head slowly. I didn't stay to watch. I left before the sound of it could follow me home. But now, he let out a shuddering breath. Now someone's been following me, watching. I keep hearing footsteps, but when I turn, nothing. I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking someone's in the room with me. Father Brown studied him. Guilt is a heavy burden, Mr. David, the man muttered. David Lane. Guilt will whisper to you long before the executioner arrives, Father Brown said. But tell me, why come to me? I cannot erase what you saw. David's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Because I heard things about you, Father, that you see things, that you can stop things before they get worse. Father Brown sighed. There is no stopping sin, Mr. Lane, only revealing it. David's eyes darted past him toward the great wooden doors of the church. Then maybe I made a mistake coming here. There was a shuffle at the entrance, a brief gust of wind pushing the doors inward. A man stood there now, leaning casually against the frame as if he had all the time in the world. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face carved from the same stone as the city itself. Sharp, weathered, unyielding. His smile was lazy, but there was nothing slow about his eyes. Funny thing about mistakes, he said, they tend to be permanent when Lucio Cardona is involved. David's breath hitched. Father Brown remained seated. And you are? The man smirked. Let's just say I work for someone who doesn't appreciate loose ends. His gaze flickered to David. And you, my friend, are unraveling. David was shaking. I didn't say anything. But you thought about it, the man murmured. And Lucio doesn't like thinking men. Father Brown exhaled slowly, then rose to his feet. This is a church, sir. You may threaten men in the street, but in here, you will show respect. The man's smirk didn't waver. I respect God plenty, Father. It's people I don't trust. And yet, Father Brown mused, God tends to have the last word. The man studied him, and for a moment, something unreadable flickered in his gaze. Then he sighed, almost as if he were tired. Father, I don't want to hurt you, and I don't want to make a mess in a place like this. But David here, he made a choice, and choices come with consequences. Father Brown nodded. Indeed, they do. There was a pause. Then, in the quiet, Father Brown said, Tell me, Mr. Lane, why was Danny Russo in that room? David hesitated. I don't know. Maybe he stole from Lucio. Maybe he crossed him somehow. Father Brown's voice was gentle, but firm. And yet, Lucio let you see it. Why? David's face twisted. I don't. Father Brown turned his gaze to the enforcer. Because Mr. Lane wasn't just a witness, he was meant to be a messenger. The man at the door didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. Father Brown continued. Lucio wanted Mr. Lane to run, to panic, to come crawling to the wrong people, and eventually to lead him to something more valuable than a frightened witness. David paled. What are you saying? Father Brown adjusted his glasses. I'm saying that perhaps Lucio wasn't cleaning up a loose end. He was baiting a trap. A beat of silence. Then David exhaled sharply. No, that doesn't. But the enforcer was already reaching into his coat. Father Brown raised a hand. I wouldn't, he said mildly. The man paused, his fingers hesitating. Father Brown smiled slightly. You see, I have something Lucio never counted on. The man frowned. What? The priest's gaze was steady. Faith. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly the enforcer sighed. Lucio isn't gonna like this. Lucio will have to live with it, Father Brown said. The man hesitated. Then he turned, disappearing into the night. David shuddered. That's it? Just like that? Father Brown patted his shoulder. Not quite, but you'll find that the weight of truth is often heavier than any bullet. David looked at him, something fragile in his expression. And now? Father Brown smiled. Now, we pray. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Vestry. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days. It smeared the city into a haze of neon and regret, the streets a black mirror reflecting everything that slunk through them. The people who walked in this weather had nowhere else to go, and neither did their sins. The world smelled of damp concrete, stale cigarettes, and broken promises. Father Brown moved through it all, his small, round figure lost beneath a coat too big for him, his hat pulled low over his face. He wasn't a man people noticed. That was his gift. He could disappear into a crowd just as easily as a whisper in a confession box. And tonight, he needed that quiet invisibility more than ever. He had been called to St. Mark's, a church as forgotten as the God it once glorified. It sat hunched between 2 dying buildings, its steeple cracked, its stone steps worn smooth by generations who no longer bothered to kneel. The kind of place that still held on to its faith. But only just. The vestry door had been left unlocked, as if someone wanted him to find it that way. Inside, the air was thick with damp wood and candle wax, the scent of incense clinging to the past. The rain drummed against the stained glass windows, the colors running in the dim glow. But something else was wrong. Father Brown knew it before he saw the shape sprawled on the floor, half hidden in shadow. A man. His suit was expensive, or had been, before the rain and blood. Ruined. His face was slack, eyes open, staring at the vaulted ceiling as if waiting for an answer that would never come. A deep gash marred his throat, his tie soaked crimson. The knife lay beside him, gleaming like a confessional sin in candlelight. Father Brown sighed. There was always something terrible about the quiet that followed death. The world should have noticed, should have stopped, should have screamed, but it never did. Instead, the only sound was the whisper of fabric, as someone moved in the darkness. Father Brown, a voice murmured, always where the trouble is. He turned. She stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame like she owned the place. A dress of dark silk, a cigarette burning lazily between her fingers. Her lips painted the color of wine, her eyes unreadable beneath the soft glow of the vestry lamp. Lily, Father Brown said gently. She exhaled smoke, watching him through the veil of gray. Did you kill him, Father? He glanced down at the corpse. No, she smiled. Pity. That would have made things interesting. Father Brown stepped around the body. And yet, here you are. She took another drag, her expression unreadable. He was supposed to meet me. Father Brown studied her. Why? Her lips curved. He had something he wanted to confess. Father Brown watched her carefully. Confession requires faith. Lily let out a quiet laugh. Or fear. He didn't argue. The dead man had been someone important once. Father Brown could see it in the way he carried himself, even in death. Power sat differently on a man when he believed it belonged to him. But power had a habit of slipping away, and when it did, it tended to take a man's life with it. "You know who he was," Father Brown said. Lily's gaze flickered. "Nathaniel Kane." Father Brown frowned slightly. The name meant something. A banker, yes, but not just any banker. A man with connections, the kind that didn't show up in ledgers, but in hushed voices and missing people. A man who didn't fear the law because the law feared him. Why would Nathaniel Kane want to confess? Lily tilted her head. "A conscience can be a dangerous thing, Father. If you have one, it can kill you. If you don't, it'll kill someone else." Father Brown sighed. "And yet, he came to you." She smirked. "I have my ways of making men talk." Father Brown adjusted his glasses. "Yes, but you don't listen. Not really." She didn't like that. He could see it in the way her fingers tensed around the cigarette. But Lily was too clever to let anger rule her. Instead, she smiled. "You always were a difficult man, Father." He glanced at the body. "And yet, I'm still breathing." She chuckled softly. But something about all of this was wrong. A man like Nathaniel Kane didn't confess. He controlled. He bent the world to his will, and when he couldn't, he paid someone else to do it for him. If he had been ready to unburden himself, then it wasn't because of morality, it was because of something heavier. Fear. And fear had many faces. The vestry door creaked again. Father Brown didn't turn, but he heard the weight in the footsteps. Slow. Measured. A presence that filled the room without needing to speak. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," he said quietly. The man stepped into the light. His suit was dark, crisp, tailored to perfection. His face was carved from shadow, the angles sharp enough to cut. A man used to control, a man who rarely had to remind people why they feared him. Lucio Cardona. Father Brown had never met him, but he knew him well. He had heard his name whispered in alleyways, seen his influence stain the city like ink in water. Cardona wasn't a man who asked twice. Lily's smile didn't waver, but Father Brown saw the way she straightened, the way her fingers twitched slightly against the cigarette. "Lucio," she murmured, "didn't know you were religious." Lucio's eyes flicked to Nathaniel Kane's corpse. "Kane was supposed to give me something he shouldn't have had." Father Brown adjusted his glasses. "And now he won't be giving anything to anyone." Lucio's gaze shifted to him. "You're an interesting man, Father." "So I've been told." Lucio studied him. "I should kill you." Father Brown nodded. "You could, but you won't." Lucio smirked slightly. "And why is that?" Father Brown met his gaze, evenly. "Because if you kill me, you'll never know what Kane had." Lucio's jaw tensed just slightly. Father Brown smiled faintly. "Secrets, Mr. Cardona, have a habit of burying themselves with the dead, but confession." He glanced at the corpse. "Confession is a tricky thing. It leaves echoes." Lucio's fingers twitched at his side. He didn't like this game. He was used to men breaking, to men begging. Father Brown did neither. Lily exhaled smoke. "So, what now?" Lucio didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at Father Brown for a long moment, as if measuring something unseen. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. The door shut behind him. Lily let out a slow breath. "You know, Father, one of these days, your luck's going to run out." Father Brown smiled slightly. Luck has nothing to do with it. She studied him, then chuckled. Maybe not. But tell me, do you ever get tired of playing the long game? Father Brown glanced down at Nathaniel Kane's lifeless face. No, he said quietly, because in the end, the truth always wins. Outside, the city still breathed its sins into the night. But inside, a prayer lingered in the air, unheard by most, but known by the ones who mattered. Chapter 4. The Man Who Left No Footprints. The rain came down in long silver needles, carving rivulets through the city's filth, pooling in the cracked pavement like old regrets. It was the kind of night that blurred the edges of things, where figures slipped through the mist like ghosts, and the weight of the sky pressed down on men already burdened by their sins. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and was swallowed by the dark. Father Brown moved through the alleyways with the quiet ease of someone who had learned to listen to the city rather than fight it. His shoes splashed in puddles, but his step was light. The letter had arrived at St. Dominic's an hour before. The ink smudged, the words written in a hand that had known both violence and desperation. I need to talk. The docks, Warehouse 16. Midnight. Please, Father. I don't have much time. No name, just that trembling plea. He had seen many things left unsaid in a confessional, a man's. Fear did not always need words. It could be heard in his breath, in the way his hands trembled as he reached for the cross. Whoever had written this had known death was close. The only question was whether it had already arrived. The docks stretched out into the darkness, long wooden arms reaching toward the black water, where ships slumbered in the thick fog. Warehouse 16 loomed ahead, its corrugated metal walls rusting at the edges, the heavy sliding door left slightly ajar. Father Brown stepped inside. The silence was heavy, broken only by the slow drip of water from a leaking pipe. Wooden crates were stacked in uneven towers, their faded shipping labels peeling away like dead skin. The air smelled of salt and rot. And then there was the body. It lay sprawled near the center of the room, face down in a widening pool of blood. The man had been young, no more than 30, his suit still pressed, as if death had caught him before he could finish pretending he belonged in a world of polished shoes and soft hands. A small pistol lay inches from his outstretched fingers, but Father Brown knew, even before kneeling, that the man hadn't fired a single shot. A noise, soft, a shuffle against the far wall, where the shadows thickened between the crates. Father Brown did not move immediately. Instead, he adjusted his glasses, straightened his coat, and spoke into the dimness. If you intend to kill me as well, I would prefer we, at least, introduce ourselves first. Silence. Then, from the dark, a figure stepped forward. She moved like smoke, a long dark coat, cinched tight at the waist, high heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. The cigarette between her fingers burned low, its ember glowing faintly as she studied him. Father Brown, she said, exhaling a ribbon of smoke, you have a habit of walking into places where men die. Lily, he said simply. She smiled, but it didn't touch her eyes. That's twice. Now, Father, people might start to think we have a connection. He glanced at the body. Did you know him? Her gaze flickered downward, and for a fraction of a second, something unreadable passed over her face. Once, not well enough. Father Brown studied her. and yet well enough to be here before the police. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. I never know whether you're naive or just fearless. Neither, he said, just observant. Lily's smile tightened. Then, you already know what happened here, don't you? Father Brown sighed. I know that the man who left no footprints was the one who pulled the trigger. Something shifted in her expression, a hesitation, too brief to name. What do you mean? He gestured toward the floor. The rain, Miss Lily. It followed me in, as it would have followed anyone who came after, and yet the blood has settled undisturbed. No muddy tracks, no hurried retreat, as if the killer was never truly here at all. Lily's cigarette paused halfway to her lips. Then slowly, she exhaled. You always do that, Father. Do what? Find the one thing no one else is looking for. Father Brown glanced at the body. It's not difficult. Most people aren't looking for the truth. They're looking for something they can understand. Before she could answer, footsteps echoed from outside. Heavy, deliberate. The slow, certain rhythm of men who did not need to hurry because they already owned the room. They were about to walk into... Lily muttered something under her breath and crushed out her cigarette against a crate. We should leave. That would be unwise, Father Brown said mildly. She turned to him, frowning. Do you have a death wish, Father? No, he said, but I have patience. The warehouse door groaned open. 3 men entered, their suits damp from the rain, their faces carved from shadow. The one in the middle was the kind of man who had stopped fearing consequences a long time ago, Lucio Cardona. His gaze flicked to the body, then to Lily, then to Father Brown. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. Father, he said smoothly, I was beginning to think you were following me. Father Brown inclined his head. Perhaps the same could be said of you, Mr. Cardona. Lucio chuckled, stepping further into the room. I had an arrangement with Mr. Pierce here. He nodded at the body. He failed to honor it. Father Brown adjusted his glasses. And so you killed him? Lucio smiled faintly. Now, Father, that's not very charitable of you. I didn't kill him, but I won't lose sleep over it either. Father Brown nodded. No, I suspect the only thing that keeps you awake is opportunity. Lucio's gaze sharpened. Lily shifted slightly, her expression unreadable. Father Brown turned to her. Miss Lily, would you happen to know why Mr. Pierce was afraid enough to summon a priest, but not afraid enough to run? She hesitated. Lucio studied her. That's a good question, sweetheart. Her fingers twitched at her side. He had something, Lucio. Something he thought would get him out. Lucio's expression remained neutral. And? Lily exhaled slowly, and he gave it to someone he trusted before he died. Lucio didn't blink. Did he now? Lily smiled faintly. You're standing in the same room as them, darling. Lucio's jaw tightened just slightly. Father Brown watched him. A secret is a heavy thing, Mr. Cardona. It's much like a sin. It doesn't stay buried. It doesn't disappear. It lingers, growing heavier with time until it breaks the man who holds it. Lucio studied him. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled. I don't have time for riddles, Father. Father Brown nodded. No, but you have time for patience, don't you? After all, the truth always surfaces. If Mr. Pierce gave his secret away, then you need only wait for it to reveal itself. Lucio's lips pressed into a thin line. Father Brown smiled slightly. Or you could kill us all and never know what it was. Lucio's fingers twitched. Then slowly, he stepped back. One of these days, Father, he murmured, Someone's going to call your bluff. Father Brown tilted his head. I never bluff, Mr. Cardona. Lucio studied him for a moment longer. Then, without another word, he turned and left, his men trailing behind him. Lily let out a slow breath. Well, that was fun. Father Brown glanced at the body once more. Mr. Pierce left no footprints, but his past did, and it caught up to him. She smirked. Is that supposed to be profound? Father Brown smiled faintly. Only if you're listening. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing away footprints that had never been there to begin with. Chapter 5. Death at the End of the Confessional. The city was a living thing, breathing sin and swallowing its own secrets, coughing up bodies when the weight of them became too much. The streets gleamed with the recent rain, washed clean of the day's filth, but not its history. Father Brown walked past flickering neon signs that buzzed like dying fireflies, the wet pavement reflecting colors that didn't belong in a place where men whispered their last prayers in alleyways. He had always been drawn to places where the lost souls gathered, but tonight it was the lost who had come to him first. The call had come just before the bells of St. Dominic's tolled for midnight mass. A voice, low and raw, whispered through the receiver, I need to confess, Father. I need to tell someone before it's too late. There had been something else in the voice, something sharp-edged and afraid, a hesitation, a silence that stretched too long, as if the speaker had already seen the shadow of his own ending. Then the line had gone dead. Father Brown had listened to too many last confessions to ignore one, so he walked through the dark streets with a quiet patience, his coat drawn close against the cold, his small round face unreadable. When he reached St. Dominic's, the great wooden doors stood slightly ajar, breathing out the scent of melted wax and stone, damp with age. Inside, the church was hushed, the only sound the steady drip of water from some unseen leak. The confessional stood near the back, carved from old mahogany, its door slightly open, waiting. He stepped inside. The booth smelled of damp wool and something metallic, faint but unmistakable. The small lattice screen on the other side was empty, but there was a stillness there, a presence that had not yet fully left. Father Brown reached forward, pushed the door open. The body slumped forward, blood soaking into the wooden floor, pooling around a gun that had slipped from lifeless fingers. The man's face was twisted in something between sorrow and relief, as if even death had been a release. A note, smudged with crimson, lay crumpled beneath his hand. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. Father Brown sighed. The city had a habit of killing men before they could find redemption. He studied the body. The man had been well-dressed, but not the kind of well-dressed that came from old money. No, this was borrowed wealth. Quick cash and bad decisions, the smell of whiskey and desperation still clinging to him. His coat had been pulled tight against his chest, but there was no bullet wound there. Instead, the blood had pooled from the back of his head, staining the collar of his once white shirt. Someone had made sure his confession would never be spoken. A noise from behind him. Soft footsteps. The quiet creak of the church doors shifting in the wind. Father Brown didn't turn immediately. Instead, he spoke, his voice steady. A man should not die before his sins can be laid bare. And yet, here he is. A pause, then a voice, smooth as oil on water. Funny thing about confessions, Father. Sometimes they make things worse. Father Brown turned. The man standing in the shadows was tall, his suit sharp despite the weather, his hat tilted just enough to keep his eyes in darkness. But Father Brown didn't need to see them to know the kind of man he was. There were men who carried their sins on their shoulders, and then there were men who buried them so deep they no longer recognized their own weight. This was the latter. "You knew him," Father Brown said simply. The man smirked. He owed people who don't like waiting. Father Brown studied him. "And now I suppose those people are satisfied." The man shrugged. "Satisfied is a funny word. Let's just say things are settled." Father Brown looked back at the body. "No," he said quietly. "They are only just beginning." The man's smirk faltered. "What's that supposed to mean, Father?" Father Brown knelt beside the corpse, his fingers brushing the edge of the bloodied note. "You see, men who run from their sins often leave them in plain sight." The man took a step closer. "You're playing a dangerous game, old man." Father Brown smiled faintly. "Games require pieces to move, and I think you've already lost yours." The man tensed. For the first time, the careful confidence wavered. "You don't know anything." Father Brown rose to his feet. "Oh, but I do. This man didn't come to me because he was afraid of death. He came to me because he had already accepted it. He knew something that could not be undone. And that, my friend, is why he had to be silenced before his confession reached the wrong ears." The man's jaw tightened. Father Brown adjusted his glasses. "But you see, secrets have a habit of slipping through the cracks, even in death." There was a long silence. Then the man let out a slow breath, his shoulders shifting as if shaking off something invisible. "You don't scare me, Father." Father Brown smiled. "That, my son, is your first mistake." The man hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he turned, vanishing back into the shadows, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by the vast emptiness of the church. Father Brown sighed, then knelt once more beside the body. He pressed 2 fingers to the man's forehead, in silent benediction. His eyes filled with something not quite sadness, not quite acceptance. Outside, the city continued its restless breathing. The rain began to fall again, washing the sins from the streets, but never erasing them. The dead man had left his confession unfinished, but Father Brown knew that somewhere in the echo of his last words, the truth still lingered. And the city would never let a truth like that remain hidden for long. Chapter 6. The Woman with 2 Faces. The city at night was a thing of shadows and half-truths, wrapped in neon and soaked in sin. The rain had come and gone, leaving the streets glistening like wet ink, the reflections of neon signs flickering in puddles where rats darted for cover. It was the kind of night where ghosts walked, not the dead, but the living, men and women who had long since sold their souls for something they couldn't quite name. Father Brown moved through it all, small and unassuming, his round face lost beneath the brim of his hat, his steps quiet but deliberate. The letter had arrived at St. Dominic's just as the last candle was snuffed out. No name, just a few hurried words. "Meet me at the Red Lantern. Midnight. I need to confess." He had received enough of these to know they rarely led to redemption, only regret. But regret had a way of speaking louder than anything else when the walls of a city pressed in too tight. The Red Lantern was the kind of place where people went to forget themselves, a bar tucked between 2 abandoned warehouses, the neon flickering with a sickly red glow. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the scent of cheap gin. The piano in the corner played something slow and sad, the kind of tune that made men sink deeper into their drinks. She was waiting at the bar. She looked like a woman who belonged in a place like this, but didn't want to be there. A dress of deep blue clung to her like secrets she wasn't ready to share, her dark hair swept to one side, her lips painted the color of wine. When she turned, her eyes locked onto Father Brown's, and for a moment, something flickered behind them. Relief, maybe, or something darker. "Father Brown," she said, her voice smooth, with just a hint of something practiced. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Father Brown pulled out a chair and sat. "I usually do." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Then you know why I called you." He folded, his hands on the table. "I know you think confession can save you. I also know that you wouldn't be here unless you'd already tried everything else." She exhaled, reaching for her cigarette case. The silver gleamed under the dim light as she tapped one out and lit it with a steady hand. "I need to tell you something, Father, but I need to know it stays between us." "That depends," he said. "Some confessions aren't meant for the ears of God alone." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There's a man, Vincent Carraway. He's dead." Father Brown tilted his head slightly. "And this concerns you how?" "Because I was the last person to see him alive," she said. "And because the police think I killed him." Father Brown didn't react. He had heard too many truths dressed as lies, too many lies wrapped in sincerity. "Did you?" She held his gaze, the smoke curling around her face. "No, but I know who did." Father Brown adjusted his glasses. "And you've decided to confess their sins for them." She smirked, but it was bitter. "Let's just say I don't have a choice." Before he could respond, the bar door swung open. The man who entered had the look of someone who spent too much time deciding the fate of others. His suit was crisp, his eyes sharper than the blade he probably carried somewhere beneath the fabric. A cop, but not the kind that protected, the kind that collected. Detective Frank Mallory. He spotted them immediately, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Father Brown," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Funny running into you here." Father Brown turned slightly in his chair. "Detective." Mallory's eyes flicked to the woman. "Miss Lillian Hart, you've been busy." She leaned back, exhaling smoke. "You know me, Detective. Always in the wrong place at the wrong time." Mallory pulled up a chair without asking and leaned in, his presence like the smell of gunpowder before a shot. "Vincent Carraway is dead, and you were seen leaving his apartment not long before he was found with a bullet in his skull." "That's a hell of a coincidence, sweetheart." Lillian took a slow drag. "If I killed him, why would I be sitting here talking to a priest?" Mallory's smirk didn't waver. "Because you think he can save you, he can't." Father Brown adjusted his hat slightly. "That depends on what she needs saving from." Mallory's eyes turned cold. "You think she's innocent." Father Brown met his gaze evenly. "I think innocence is a complicated thing." Mallory chuckled, but it was dry. "You know what I think, Father? I think Miss Hart here played Carraway for a fool. Maybe he got too close. Maybe he found out something he wasn't supposed to. And now she's trying to run before the whole thing catches up to her." Lillian exhaled slowly. "You always think the worst of me, Frank." "Because I know you," Mallory said. "You change faces like most people change coats." Father Brown watched them both carefully. "And yet, You haven't arrested her. Mallory's jaw tightened. Not yet. Lillian flicked her cigarette away. Then you're wasting our time, detective. Mallory stood, smoothing his suit. You always were a slippery one, Lily, but I'll be seeing you. As he walked away, Lillian turned back to Father Brown, something tight in her expression. He's right about one thing, you know. Father Brown nodded slightly. You have more than one face. She smiled faintly. And which one do you think is real? Father Brown watched her for a long moment. The one that's afraid. Her fingers curled slightly against the table. I didn't kill him, Father, but I know who did. Father Brown sighed. Then you know that truth is the one thing men fear more than death. She swallowed hard. Vincent was working for someone. A man who doesn't like loose ends. I was supposed to be one, but I ran before he could tie things up. Father Brown adjusted his glasses. And now you want protection. She looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. I want absolution. Father Brown exhaled slowly. That, my dear, is something only you can earn. She held his gaze a moment longer. Then, without another word, she stood and disappeared into the smoke-filled room. Father Brown watched her go. Outside, the rain had started again, washing away footprints, but never the sins that left them. Chapter 7. A murderer walks into the light. The city was restless that night, like a wounded animal that couldn't decide whether to lash out or die quietly in a corner. The rain had come in sheets, leaving the streets slick and shimmering, reflecting the neon signs that buzzed and flickered in half-lit promises. The gutters ran dark, carrying away the filth of men who thought their sins could be washed clean. Father Brown walked with his usual quiet patience, his coat pulled tight against the damp, his round face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He had been called, though not by bells or faith. The note had been slipped under the door of St. Dominic's sometime before dawn, and the words had been hurried, desperate. Father, I need to confess. Meet me at St. Augustine's. I don't want to die with this on my soul. No name, no explanation, just the weight of something heavy pressing against the ink. St. Augustine's stood at the edge of the city, a forgotten church with sagging doors and walls that had seen too much suffering to be beautiful anymore. It had once been a place of light, but now the shadows inside stretched long, the candles flickering weakly against the draught. Father Brown stepped inside and closed the door against the night, his footsteps soft on the worn stone floor. The confessional was waiting. He slid into the narrow wooden booth, the scent of old varnish and fading incense thick in the air. The screen on the other side remained empty for a long moment, and then there was a breath, a hesitation. Father. The voice was low, raw. I'm here, Father Brown said gently. A pause, then the whisper of a man unraveling. I killed a man. Father Brown did not move. Tell me. A sharp inhale. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to be like that. Like what? Another breath, jagged this time. I only meant to scare him. That was the deal. A warning. But things got out of hand, and now he's dead. Father Brown closed his eyes briefly. Who was he? A silence. Then, a man with too many enemies and not enough friends. Father Brown sighed. That is most men, I'm afraid. There was a sound, a shift of fabric, as if the man on the other side was rubbing his face with shaking hands. I don't know why I came here. Father Brown tilted his head slightly. Because you think you can still be saved. a harsh, bitter laugh. "Can I?" Father Brown was quiet. For a moment. "That depends. Do you seek forgiveness, or only a way out?" The man was silent. Then suddenly, there was a noise outside. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The confessor's breath hitched. "They found me." Father Brown reached for the door, stepping out of the booth just as the church doors swung open. 3 men entered, their coats dark with rain, their movements careful, predatory. The one in the middle was Lucio Cardona. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Father Brown, fancy seeing you here." Father Brown adjusted his glasses. "The church is always open." Lucio's gaze flicked to the confessional. "And so are the mouths of frightened men." The man inside had gone deathly still. Lucio took a step forward. "Come out, Benny. It's over." Silence. Father Brown spoke calmly. "Mr. Cardona, I do hope you're not about to do something ungodly in a house of God." Lucio smirked. "Father, I've done a great many things in worse places than this." "But never without consequence," Father Brown said. Lucio's smirk faltered, just slightly. "You see," Father Brown continued, "sins, much like crimes, have a habit of being remembered, even when you wish they wouldn't be." Lucio exhaled sharply, turning his attention back to the confessional. "Enough. Benny, you know the rules. You talk, you die. You run, you die tired." The door creaked slightly. A man stepped out. Benny wasn't much to look at. He was thin, with a face that had seen more nights without sleep than it should have. His hands trembled slightly as he turned toward Lucio. "Please," he whispered. Lucio's smile was slow, patient. "You know I can't do that." Father Brown studied them both. Then he sighed. "You were always going to kill him, weren't you?" Lucio didn't answer. Father Brown nodded to himself. "Then why chase him? Why the performance?" Lucio's expression flickered. Father Brown turned to Benny. "Because you weren't supposed to run, were you? You were supposed to disappear. Quietly. But you didn't. You did something foolish." Benny swallowed hard. Father Brown nodded. "You came here." Lucio's eyes darkened. Father Brown smiled faintly. "That means something, you know. A man who knows he's already dead doesn't ask for forgiveness. He asks for a witness." Lucio took another step forward. Father Brown turned to him. "Mr. Cardona, I think you should know something about your friend here. He's already confessed." Lucio's jaw tensed. Father Brown's voice remained quiet. "That means you can't kill him. Not here. Not now." Lucio let out a slow breath, as if he were weighing the weight of a gun against the weight of a prayer. Father Brown tilted his head. "Unless, of course, you want to make a statement, but that would be quite a mess to clean up, wouldn't it?" Lucio's fingers twitched at his side. Then slowly, he turned away. "Come on," he muttered to his men. "We're done here." The doors swung shut behind them. Benny let out a breath that was almost a sob. Father Brown placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now," he said quietly, "shall we talk about redemption?" Outside, the city still murmured, its streets still slick with rain. But inside, beneath the fading candlelight, a murderer had stepped into the light. Chapter 8. The Last Drink of Father Ignatius. The city had a way of swallowing men whole, and when it spat them back out, they were never quite the same. The rain had started early that evening, a fine mist at first, then a steady downpour that slicked the streets like polished obsidian. It turned the gutters into rivers and washed the filth off the sidewalks, though never off the men who walked them. The neon signs buzzed and flickered, casting their sickly glow onto the faces of lost souls and those who preyed on them. Father Brown moved through it all like a shadow, small and round and quiet, the rain beading on his worn coat as he made his way toward a place he knew he shouldn't go. He had received the message an hour before, slipped under the heavy wooden doors of St. Dominic's. The paper was damp, the ink smudged in places, but the words were clear enough. Father Brown, I need you. The Black Harp, midnight. It was the I that made him go. There weren't many priests left in this part of the city. The ones who had stayed long enough to see what lay beneath the surface had either lost their faith or lost themselves. But there was one who had walked the line longer than most, a man whose name was spoken in the kind of whispers that carried equal parts reverence and pity. Father Ignatius. The Black Harp was one of those places that never truly closed, where men sat nursing their drinks as if they held the answers to old sins. The door creaked as Father Brown stepped inside, and the heavy warmth of alcohol and regret washed over him. The place was dim, the lighting low enough to hide the age in the faces of the women who leaned against the bar, and the weariness in the eyes of the men who drank to forget. He saw him immediately. Father Ignatius sat at the far end of the bar, his broad shoulders hunched over a glass of something dark. He had once been a man of great strength, both in body and in faith, but time had chipped away at both. His collar was still there, barely visible beneath the folds of his coat, but it no longer fit the man who wore it. Father Brown moved toward him, stepping over the broken edges of old dreams and empty promises. You called for me, he said softly. Ignatius didn't look up at first. He simply exhaled, the sound of a man, carrying something he couldn't quite set down. Then finally, he turned his weary gaze toward Father Brown. You shouldn't have come. Father Brown slid onto the stool beside him. And yet, here I am. A small, tired smile. You always were stubborn. Father Brown glanced at the half-empty glass. And you always drank alone. Ignatius chuckled, but there was no humor in it. He picked up the glass, swirled the liquid inside, then set it down again. I need your help, Brown, and I need you to listen before you say no. Father Brown nodded, waiting. Ignatius rubbed a hand over his face. There's a man who's going to die, tonight, and I need you to stop it. Father Brown tilted his head slightly. If you know about it, why not go to the police? Ignatius let out a breath. Because the police already know, and they're not going to do a damn thing. Father Brown sighed. Then tell me. Ignatius took another sip from his glass before speaking. His name is James Holloway. Used to be a lawyer, a good one, until he took the wrong case and made the wrong enemies. He's got something he shouldn't, something that's going to get him killed. He came to me, looking for a way out. Father Brown studied him. And you gave him one? Ignatius's eyes darkened. I told him to run, but he didn't listen. Father Brown folded his hands. And now? Ignatius hesitated. Now, he's got an appointment with death at the old railway yard. Midnight. Father Brown glanced at the clock behind the bar. 5 minutes to midnight. He stood. Come with me. Ignatius didn't move. Brown. Father. Brown's voice was gentle, but firm. If we're too late, you should at least be there to pray for him. For a long moment, Ignatius didn't speak. Then he sighed, set down his glass, and stood. Let's go. The railway yard was a graveyard of steel and rust. where trains once carried men toward the future, but now only sat abandoned, their engines long silent. The rain had softened into a fine drizzle, mist curling around the metal giants like ghosts reluctant to leave. Father Brown moved. Through the shadows, Ignatius close behind. They didn't have to look long. James Holloway stood alone near the tracks, his coat too thin for the night air, his breath visible in the damp cold. He was waiting, not for salvation, but for the inevitable. A second figure emerged from the darkness. Lucio Cardona. Father Brown sighed. It was always Lucio. The gangster's smile was slow and knowing. Father Brown, fancy meeting you here. Father Brown stepped forward. I do seem to have a habit of arriving at inopportune moments. Lucio chuckled. Depends on who you ask. He turned his attention back to Holloway. You should have stayed quiet, Jimmy. Would have saved us all a lot of trouble. Holloway swallowed hard, but didn't move. I can't do that. Lucio shook his head. Pity. Father Brown adjusted his glasses. Mr. Cardona, I wonder if I might make a suggestion. Lucio raised a brow. A sermon, Father? Father Brown smiled faintly. Not quite. Just a thought. If you kill this man, you silence him, but you also draw attention. You make noise. Lucio's jaw tightened. Father Brown continued. But if you let him leave, you make him disappear. And sometimes, disappearing is worse than dying. Lucio studied him. You really believe that? Father Brown's eyes were calm. I believe a man only truly dies when he is forgotten. The words hung in the damp air. Lucio exhaled, then turned to Holloway. You leave the city tonight. You don't come back. You don't talk. Or next time, the good father won't be here to save you. Holloway nodded quickly. Lucio turned and disappeared into the mist. Father Brown watched until the night swallowed him whole. Ignatius let out a breath. You really think he'll let him go? Father Brown smiled faintly. No, but for tonight, it's enough. They stood there in the rain, the city stretching out before them, heavy with secrets. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled, though no trains ran anymore. Father Brown turned to Ignatius. Come back to the church. Ignatius hesitated. Then finally, he nodded, and together they walked into the light. Chapter 9. Blood on the altar steps. The city held its breath beneath the weight of the rain, the kind that washed away the sins of the careless, but left the guilt untouched in those who carried it deep in their bones. The neon signs flickered half-heartedly, their electric glow spilling across the wet pavement like oil on water. The gutters ran dark, feeding into the sewers where forgotten things slithered unseen. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a sound too late to stop whatever had already happened. Father Brown walked with measured steps through the misty streets, his coat pulled close, his hat low. The night had its own rhythm, its own way of swallowing the unwary. But he had never feared the dark. Not when he understood what men did within it. He had received the call just before matins, the voice on the other end, barely more than a breath. Come to St. Vincent's, hurry. St. Vincent's stood at the edge of the city, old stone, blackened by soot, its steeple looming like a watchful sentinel over the streets where faith had long since become a relic. It was the kind of place where men sought solace in whispers, where the desperate found shelter from the things that hunted them. The heavy wooden doors hung open when he arrived, swinging gently in the wind. Inside, The scent of melting wax and damp wood filled the air, the flickering candlelight casting uneasy shadows along the pews. And then he saw it. Blood on the altar, steps, a dark stain creeping down the stone, fresh and glistening in the dim light. And above it, slumped against the base of the altar, a man in a priest's collar, his chest soaked in red. Father Brown moved forward, quiet as the hush before a confession. The man was still alive, but barely. His breath rattled in his throat, his hands twitching weakly. Father Brown knelt beside him. "Father Moreau," he said gently. The dying man's eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. His lips moved, the words barely a whisper. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Father Brown took his hand. "Tell me." A shuddering breath. "I—" The rest of the words faded into nothing, his fingers going slack. The church held its silence. Father Brown exhaled slowly and closed the dead man's eyes. The city was relentless, always hungry for another offering. But this was different. Blood on the altar was not just murder. It was sacrilege. Footsteps echoed from the entrance, slow, deliberate. Father Brown did not turn immediately. He recognized the rhythm, the kind of careful, controlled steps that belonged to men who preferred their power to be felt before it was seen. "Father Brown," the voice drawled, smooth as smoke curling from the end of a cigarette. He rose and turned to face Detective Frank Mallory. Mallory had the weary look of a man who had seen too much but learned too little. His suit was expensive but wrinkled, his tie slightly loosened, as if he had spent too many hours wrestling with a conscience that no longer quite fit. He glanced at the body, then back at Father Brown. "You always seem to be standing over a corpse, Father." Father Brown adjusted his glasses. "Perhaps if you arrived sooner, Detective, you might find them still breathing." Mallory smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Funny." He stepped forward, crouching beside the body. "Father Moreau didn't take you for the type to mix with the wrong crowd." Father Brown studied him. "And yet, here we are." Mallory sighed and straightened. "This city eats its own, Father, even the righteous." Father Brown looked at the blood-streaked altar. "No one is righteous, Detective, only forgiven." A flicker of something crossed Mallory's face, but it was gone before it could settle. He reached into his coat and pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with practiced ease. "You wouldn't happen to know why someone would want to put a bullet in a priest, would you?" Father Brown clasped his hands together. "I imagine the answer is much the same as why anyone kills, Detective. A debt unpaid, a truth revealed, or perhaps—" His gaze met Mallory's, "a sin too great to be absolved." Mallory exhaled smoke, watching him carefully. "You're saying this wasn't just some random act?" Father Brown shook his head. "Murder in the street is impulse. Murder in a church is intent." Mallory tapped ash onto the cold stone floor. "Then we're dealing with someone who wanted a message sent." Father Brown nodded. "Or someone who wanted a voice silenced." A gust of wind rattled the stained glass windows, the night pressing close against the old stone walls. Then, from the darkness beyond the pews, a voice, low and edged with something dangerous. "You ask too many questions, Father." Father Brown turned. A woman stood near the confessional, her figure wrapped in a dark coat, the fur at the collar brushing against pale skin. Her lips were painted the color of wine, her gloved hands resting lightly at her sides. "Lily." She tilted her head, her gaze unreadable. Father Moreau was playing with fire, and he got burned. Father Brown studied her. And what was he playing with? She exhaled a quiet laugh. Secrets. Mallory stepped forward. Lady, I don't have the patience for riddles. Lily's eyes flicked to him. Then perhaps you're in the wrong profession, detective. Mallory scowled. You got something to say. Say it. She leaned against the confessional. Moreau had something people wanted back. And now he's dead. Father Brown watched her. And what was it? A pause. Then softly, a list. Mallory tensed. Of what? Lily's voice was almost a whisper. Names. The word hung in the air, heavy and cold. Father Brown sighed. And I imagine the wrong people wanted it to disappear. Lily nodded. Mallory ran a hand through his hair. This just got messy. Father Brown looked at the altar steps, at the blood still pooling there. It already was. The city was built on shadows, and every man had a name that could either save him or damn him. Father Moreau had learned that too late. Mallory turned to Lily. Who has the list now? She hesitated. I don't know. Father Brown watched her carefully. And yet, you're still breathing, which means you're useful to whoever does. Lily smirked, but it was hollow. For now. Mallory exhaled. I need to put a body on this before it gets out of hand. Father Brown shook his head. Detective, it was out of hand the moment blood touched the altar. Mallory clenched his jaw. Lily straightened. I should go before the wrong people see me here. Father Brown nodded. And yet, I suspect I will see you again before this is over. She smiled faintly. You always do. She vanished into the night, leaving only the scent of perfume and cigarette smoke behind. Mallory sighed. You think she's telling the truth? Father Brown glanced once more at the altar. No one ever does, detective. Not entirely. Mallory flicked away his cigarette. So what now? Father Brown clasped his hands. Now, we find the list. Mallory let out a dry chuckle. You make it sound easy. Father Brown sighed. Nothing about sin ever is. The church stood in silence, the candles flickering weakly against the dark. Somewhere outside, the city continued to turn, its gears grinding, its sinners running, its secrets waiting to be unearthed. But inside, on the cold stone steps of the altar, the blood remained, a stain that would not be washed away. Not yet. Chapter 10. The Midnight Visitor. The city never truly slept. It dozed, perhaps, restless and uneasy, turning over its sins in the dark. The rain had come down in sheets earlier, washing the filth from the sidewalks, but not from the people who walked them. Now it had settled into a thin mist, curling around street lamps like cigarette smoke, whispering against the rooftops. The few who remained outside at this hour had nowhere better to be. Father Brown sat alone in the rectory of St. Dominic's, a book open before him, though his eyes had long since drifted from the page. The hours past midnight were the loneliest, the ones where regret settled deepest, when men stood at their windows wondering if there was still time to undo what had been done. Sometimes they came to him, knocking hesitantly on the great wooden doors, their confessions heavy in their throats. Sometimes they didn't, and he found their stories the next morning in the pages of the paper. Their sins, written out in black ink and bad newsprint. Tonight, the knock came. 3 sharp raps against the door, precise, deliberate. Father Brown set his book aside and rose, moving through the dimly lit church with the quiet patience of a man who had spent a lifetime listening to things no one else heard. He unlatched the heavy door and pulled it open. The woman standing there was no stranger to the night. She wore it well, draped in a long dark coat, her gloved hands folded neatly before her, the damp mist clinging to the loose waves of her hair. Her lips were painted in the deep shade of something expensive, and her eyes, sharp and knowing, flickered in the candlelight. "Father Brown," she said, her voice smooth and measured, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." He studied her. "You wouldn't be here if you thought otherwise." She smiled faintly, stepping inside. The warmth of the church wrapped around her, though she carried her own chill with her, the kind that came from secrets held too long. She glanced at the empty pews, the flickering votives. "I don't suppose you keep brandy in the vestry?" "No," Father Brown said, "but I find the truth has a way of warming a man just as well." She let out a quiet laugh. "That depends on the truth, Father." He gestured toward a pew. "Would you care to sit?" She hesitated, then moved with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent too much time being watched. She slid onto the wooden bench, crossing her legs, with an elegance that suggested she was used to finer seats. Father Brown remained standing. "You know my name," he said. "May I know yours?" A pause. Then, "Margaret." He tilted his head slightly. "Your real name?" Another smile, this one more amused. "You ask too many questions, Father. It's a habit of the cloth." She exhaled softly. "Let's just say Margaret is the name I use when I need help." Father Brown folded his hands. "And do you?" She glanced at the altar, the towering crucifix above it. "I suppose that depends on whether you believe in redemption." "I do," he said simply. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into her coat and pulled something from the pocket, setting it on the pew beside her. A small silver locket. Father Brown did not move. She tapped it lightly with one gloved finger. This belonged to a man named Edward Langley. He frowned slightly. "Should I know that name?" She smiled, but there was something bitter in it. "If you read the papers, you'd know he disappeared 2 nights ago, walked out of his office at midnight, and was never seen again." Father Brown nodded slowly. "And you were the last to see him?" Margaret's eyes darkened. "Yes." Silence settled between them, thick with the weight of unspoken things. Then Father Brown sighed. "What happened to him?" She hesitated. "He was afraid. He had something men would kill for. And now I think they have." Father Brown glanced at the locket. "And what is this?" Margaret's lips pressed together. "It's proof of," she exhaled, "that Edward Langley wasn't the man people thought he was." Father Brown studied her. "And what kind of man was he?" Her fingers tightened slightly. "One who knew too much." Footsteps sounded outside, slow and deliberate. Margaret stiffened. Father Brown turned toward the door just as it creaked open. The man who entered had the careful stride of someone who always knew where he was going. His suit was tailored, his hat tilted just enough to shadow his eyes. He wasn't a thug. He was something worse. The kind of man who didn't get his hands dirty because he paid others to do it for him. "Father Brown," he said, his voice smooth and polite. "I was hoping we'd meet." Father Brown adjusted his glasses. "And you are?" The man smiled faintly. "Call me Harcourt." Margaret didn't move, but Father Brown could feel the tension coiling in her. Harcourt stepped closer, his hands resting easily in his coat pockets. "I believe the lady has something that belongs to me." Father Brown tilted his head. "And what would that be?" Harcourt's gaze flicked to the locket. Margaret's fingers curled around it. "Over my dead body," Harcourt sighed. "I'd rather not. But if it comes to that—" Father Brown took a step forward, his small frame dwarfed by the taller man. "Mr. Harcourt, you seem like a reasonable man." Harcourt chuckled. "I like to think so." "Then you understand," Father Brown continued, "that the problem with secrets is that they rarely stay hidden for long. Even if you take this locket, even if you silence Miss Margaret, the truth will find its way to light." Harcourt's jaw tightened. Father Brown smiled faintly. "Men like you rely on fear. But fear is a fickle thing. A man who has nothing left to lose is far more dangerous than one who is afraid." Margaret inhaled sharply. Harcourt's expression flickered just for a moment. Then he stepped back. "A pleasure, Father," he murmured. "I do hope we don't meet again." The door swung shut behind him. Margaret exhaled, her fingers still tight around the locket. "You took a risk." Father Brown adjusted his hat. "Faith often is." She looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. Then she smiled, just slightly. "Thank you." Father Brown inclined his head. "And now, Miss Margaret, shall we talk about the truth?" Outside, the city still whispered, its streets slick with secrets. But inside the old church, a midnight visitor had come and gone, and the night no longer felt quite so dark. Chapter 11. The Sin. No one confessed. The city was drowning in its own darkness that night, the rain coming down in sheets, turning the streets into black rivers of regret. The neon lights flickered half-heartedly, their sickly glow doing little to hold back the shadows that crept through alleyways and behind shuttered doors. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophone played a song too slow to be hopeful, the notes curling through the mist like smoke from a dying cigarette. Father Brown moved through it all, small and unassuming, the brim of his hat tilted just enough to shield his round face from the downpour. He had received the message an hour before, a crumpled slip of paper left inside the confessional at St. Dominic's. "Father, I need you. The Orchid Room. Midnight. It's about something that can't stay buried." The Orchid Room was the kind of place where men whispered their sins over glasses of whiskey, where deals were made in the corners and broken before the ice had melted in the glass. It was tucked inside a hotel that had once been grand, but now its carpets were faded and the wallpaper peeled at the edges. The kind of place that still pretended it had class, even as its guests drowned themselves in things they'd regret by morning. Father Brown stepped inside, the air thick with smoke and perfume. A pianist played something slow and mournful in the corner, his fingers moving over the keys like they were telling an old, tired story. The bartender barely glanced up as Father Brown walked past, his presence too quiet to cause suspicion, too unremarkable to be a threat. She was waiting for him in the back, a woman who belonged in a place like this, but wished she didn't. Her dress was dark, the fabric hugging her like a secret she couldn't let go of. Her hair was pinned back, a few loose strands falling over her cheek, and her lips were painted in a way that made promises she had no intention of keeping. "Father Brown," she said, her voice smooth, practiced. "You came." "You asked," he said simply. She gestured to the seat across from her, and he took it without hesitation. "You don't seem surprised," she said, studying him. "I've learned not to be," he said, "especially when the past starts knocking at the door." She let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "The past never knocks, Father. It breaks in through the window." Father Brown nodded. "And what exactly has broken in?" Tonight? She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, setting it on the table between them. It was old, creased at the edges, the ink faded from too many years pressed between the pages of something that was meant to be forgotten. A man stood in the photograph, his smile the kind that never quite reached his eyes. Father Brown looked up at her. Who is he? She tapped the photograph with one painted nail. That's what I need you to tell me. He studied her. You don't. No? Her smile was thin. I know what he was. I don't know who he was. Father Brown turned the photo slightly, letting the dim light catch the details. And why does it matter now? She hesitated, then leaned in. Because he's dead, and because someone killed him for something that happened a long time ago. Father Brown sighed. Time rarely buries anything completely. She exhaled slowly. And yet, some people keep trying. There was movement behind them, slow, deliberate. A man took a seat at the bar, ordering a drink in a voice too smooth to be casual. Another shifted near the door, lighting a cigarette, but never lifting it to his lips. Father Brown didn't need to turn around to know what they were. The woman across from him noticed too. You brought friends, he said quietly. Her fingers tightened slightly around her glass. They're not mine. Then whose? She hesitated. The kind of men who don't like unfinished business. Father Brown studied her. And what is the unfinished business? Her lips parted, but before she could speak, the bartender called out, Last call. Too early for last call. Father Brown sighed. It appears we're out of time. She glanced toward the bar, then back at him. Then we should go. No, he said simply. You should stay. Her eyes flashed. Are you trying to get me killed, Father? Father Brown adjusted his glasses. Quite the opposite. She hesitated, then whispered, They don't want me. They want the truth. And the truth, Father Brown murmured, always comes at a cost. The man at the bar rose, his drink untouched. The one at the door flicked away his cigarette. They moved in tandem, slow and confident, like men who knew there was no need to hurry. Father Brown turned to face them. Gentlemen, he said mildly. The one from the bar smiled faintly. Father Brown, I hear you have a habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Father Brown tilted his head. The truth tends to be in places no one wants it to be. The man's smile didn't waver. This doesn't concern you. Father Brown sighed. Everything concerns me, Mr. The man's expression tightened. We're just here to pick up something that belongs to us. Father Brown looked at the woman. Miss Margaret, do you belong to them? She smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm afraid I'm no one's property. The man at the door took a step forward. Let's not make this difficult. Father Brown adjusted his coat. Difficult is subjective. The man at the bar exhaled sharply. We just want the photograph. Father Brown glanced at it. Do you now? The second man's jaw tightened. Give it to us, Father, and walk away. Father Brown studied them both. Then slowly, he picked up the photograph. You see, he said, turning it over, what you fail to understand is that this isn't just a photograph. They stilled. Father Brown smiled faintly. It's a confession. The woman inhaled sharply. The men tensed. Father Brown continued. A man doesn't keep something like this unless it means something, and you wouldn't be here unless it was something you couldn't afford to let see the light of day. The man from the bar took a step forward. Careful, Father. Father Brown tilted his head. That's usually my line. The room was silent. Then the man exhaled, shaking his head. You always were too clever for your own good. Father Brown adjusted his glasses. It's not cleverness, my son, just patience. The man sighed, then turned to the woman. You should have burned it when you had the chance. She smirked. I don't burn things that might be useful later. A long pause. Then the men stepped back. Father Brown watched as they vanished through the door, the neon light flickering in their wake. The woman exhaled, then turned to him. You do realize they're not gone for good? Father Brown nodded. Nothing ever is. She studied him. So, what now? He set the photograph down. Now, we talk about the sin no one confessed. She sighed, picking up the photograph. And what if no one wants to? Father Brown smiled faintly. Then the city will do it for them. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the past had finally been unearthed. But whether it would stay buried was another matter entirely. Chapter 12. The Devil in Father Brown's Shadow. The city was restless that night, like a drunk rolling over in a gutter, mumbling sins to the pavement. Rain tapped against the windows of St. Dominic's, steady and insistent, whispering secrets only the dark could understand. The streets outside gleamed with reflections of neon signs, red and blue and sickly yellow, their glow bleeding into the puddles, distorting the truth of things. Somewhere in the distance, a siren howled, but it was the kind of sound no one paid attention to anymore. Father Brown sat in his office, the candlelight flickering against the old wood of his desk. The room smelled of paper, ink, and the lingering scent of candle wax. He was alone, as he often was in the late hours, his small round face calm, his hands folded over an unopened letter. It had been left for him in the usual way, slipped under the church doors in the dead of night, the kind of thing that spoke of desperation rather than devotion. He sighed, adjusted his glasses, and opened it. Father, I need to speak with you. I have seen the devil in your shadow, and he is waiting. Meet me at the old printing press on Holloway Street. Midnight. The message was unsigned. It didn't need to be. Father Brown had seen too many letters like it, words written by hands that trembled, by souls that had already weighed themselves and found the measure wanting. He took his coat from the back of his chair and stepped out into the night, the city swallowing him whole as he walked toward whatever truth waited for him. The old printing press was a building that had outlived its purpose, standing empty now, its windows shattered, its walls covered in the scrawled confessions of men who preferred to write their sins in ink instead of whispering them in a confessional. The door hung slightly open, breathing out the scent of damp paper and rusting machinery. Inside, the shadows were thick, stretching long against the broken floorboards. The remnants of forgotten newspapers littered the ground, their headlines yellowed with age. City corruption scandal, names to be revealed. One read, the ink faded, but the weight of its promise still heavy. A figure stepped from the darkness. She was tall, wrapped in a coat that cinched at the waist, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Her lips were painted in the color of blood, and her eyes, sharp as a blade, held the quiet amusement of someone who had already decided how the night would end. Father Brown, she murmured, the cigarette between her fingers, burning like a slow confession. I was beginning to think you wouldn't come. He studied her. I try not to disappoint. She smirked. Oh, but you do, just not in the usual ways. Father Brown gestured toward the empty press room. You left me an interesting message. She exhaled smoke. I wanted to see if you'd come. You already knew I would, he said simply. She nodded. I did. Father Brown watched her. And now that I'm here, what is it you want to tell me? Her smile faded slightly. It's not what I want to tell you, Father. It's what I want you to understand. There was movement behind him, slow, deliberate. Father Brown did not turn. He didn't have to. He could feel the weight of the presence behind him, the kind of quiet violence that men carried when they believed there was only one way out. Step carefully, Father, the man's voice murmured, smooth and low. You're on dangerous ground. Father Brown sighed. I often am. The woman tilted her head. You really should learn to walk away from things that aren't your concern. Father Brown turned slightly, glancing at the man now standing in the doorway. He was tall, his suit crisp despite the damp air, his hat tilted just enough to keep his face in shadow. Lucio Cardona. Father Brown had crossed paths with him before, the kind of man who didn't make threats because he didn't need to. He simply made arrangements. Lucio smiled faintly. You always seem to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, Father. Father Brown adjusted his glasses. Perhaps the time and place are wrong, but I believe the company is exactly as it should be, Lucio chuckled. Still playing the clever priest, I see. Father Brown studied him. And you're still playing a game you've already lost. Lucio's smile faded just slightly. Careful. Father Brown turned, back to the woman. You told me you'd seen the devil in my shadow. I assume you meant Mr. Cardona. She smirked. I meant exactly what I said. Father Brown nodded. Then let's talk about what you're really afraid of. Lucio stepped closer. Enough of this. We came here for one reason. Father Brown met his gaze. And that reason is? Lucio's jaw tightened. You already know. Father Brown sighed. A secret, then. One that was meant to stay buried. The woman exhaled, softly. But the dead don't stay buried, do they, Father? Father Brown glanced at the newspaper headlines scattered on the floor. No, neither do their sins. Lucio took another step forward. You know too much. Father Brown smiled faintly. That's usually my line. Silence stretched between them. Then slowly, Lucio exhaled, his fingers twitching at his side. Father Brown watched him carefully. You've already lost, Mr. Cardona. You just haven't accepted it yet. Lucio smirked, but it was forced. You really think so? Father Brown nodded. Because the truth is patient, but it is relentless, and sooner or later, it always wins. Lucio's gaze flickered. The woman watched them both, her expression unreadable. Then Lucio turned, vanishing into the night without another word. Father Brown looked at the woman. She sighed, dropping her cigarette, crushing it under the toe of her shoe. You really don't scare easily, do you? Father Brown smiled, faintly. Fear is for men who believe they can still lose something. She studied him. And what about you, Father? What is it you believe? He adjusted his coat. That the devil doesn't need to hide in shadows. He walks among us every day. But so does God. She let out a quiet laugh. And you think you can tell the difference? Father Brown's gaze was steady. I don't think I can. I know. The city stretched out before them, full of unanswered questions and unfinished stories. But for tonight, the past had been dragged into the light. And the devil, at least for now, had been left behind.